This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 34, Taking Flight with Cover Crops as Bird Habitat. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Today, we'll discuss the importance of cover crops and bird populations. Dr. Mike Ward is an associate professor of natural resources and environmental sciences here on the University of Illinois campus. We'll start with him and ask him to tell us just a little bit about what he does.
So I study bird conservation, bird behavior. So I study a lot. I'm an ecologist that studies primarily birds with the overarching goal to understand how to manage populations, conserve populations, or in some cases to try and manage problematic bird species.
What are your projects at the moment?
Well, we have lots of stuff going on right now. So we're studying the migration of a bird that's declining in Illinois, whippoorwills. So they migrate down to Central America and Mexico, and we're trying to understand why they're declining. We are studying Canada geese in Chicago, trying to determine how we can keep them from flying in front of airplanes at Midway Airport. We have more esoteric studies going on, trying to understand parent-offspring conflict in songbirds. So why do parents kick their babies out of the nest to a spot where they're likely to die? We have studies on eastern meadowlarks, a very common bird in agricultural lands throughout Illinois, but is showing large declines. And so we're trying to understand where they winter. They don't spend the winter in Illinois. They probably go down to Texas or maybe Mexico, and just trying to figure out what factors are contributing to their population declines.
Have you been doing work with cover crops and bird habitat in agricultural settings?
We have. So we have quite a bit of work on those. So we've looked at the impact of cover crops on migratory birds. So obviously cover crops are becoming much more common throughout the state. And so we wanted to understand what the relative value of cover crops are to migratory birds. We have another project where we work with farmers in water management to put in control structures to hold water back in early spring for birds that winter in South America and breed in the Arctic, so they can stop over in fields. And the idea is we plug up control structures to kind of control the water flow in fields, and then actually flood a little bit of the field to provide habitat for birds, and then they can pull the boards out of the control structures in April and then go back to farming. And so it's a way that we can integrate, we can work with producers and farmers to have some habitat for wildlife at the same time promoting, their business. And I'm a real big believer in that if we're going to achieve conservation, environmental conservation throughout Illinois, we have to work with the land use that's the most prevalent, which is agriculture. And I think there's lots of ways we can, simple ways we can integrate practices with producers that are both beneficial for them and beneficial for wildlife and birds.
I think it probably is fairly easy for most to understand creating temporary water structures and what that might mean for migratory birds. However, I'm wondering what the relationship might be with cover crops and bird habitat.
Yeah, so cover crops, most of our birds in Illinois are migratory, right? So they're not spending the winter in Illinois. And when they come back, a lot of them are coming back this time of year, so in March. And as you drive across Illinois this time of year, these ag fields are pretty much devoid of vegetation. And so the advent of cover crops, which obviously have some benefit for soil health and retaining nitrogen for farmers, also provide cover for a lot of our birds that arrive this time of year. And so and most of these they're not breeding yet, right? They're just migratory birds, but they need a place to find a few insects, to get out of the wind, to get out of the way of predators. And a lot of us are so used to the landscape in Illinois, we're just used to driving, along interstate and seeing pretty much bare fields. And so you get a good crop of cereal rye out there. It can really be a godsend for some of these migratory birds that are, trying to make their way back to their place to breed and are kind of stuck over an area where there's not much cover.
There's benefits for the birds. How about benefits from bringing the birds back into the habitat?
Yeah, I mean, there's environmental benefits in the context, and we haven't done a lot of research on this, but other people have. If you have a healthy bird populations around, they can contribute to keeping some of the crop pests in line. So these days we can now catch birds and take fecal samples and sequence those to determine what they're eating, and a lot of them are eating pests, insects, moths, and other things, corn, rootworm, beetles, and that kind of stuff that are are potentially contributing to some crop loss. Um, there's great work in more southern areas and more orchards where if you promote bird populations, you really reduce some of the damage you get from insects out there. And so there's that benefit. And the other thing is really there's really not a cost, right? A lot of people throughout Illinois enjoy hunting, and so pheasants are one of the species where this time of year, they're getting geared up for the breeding season, so you see a lot of males running around. Well, they need areas to hide as well, and so we find a lot of pheasants in the cover crops that are using that as an area to kind of survive, and then it provides hunting opportunities for the landowners in the fall.
Are there issues related to these food and feeding acres, crops, which are used primarily, I suppose, for the insect populations by the birds when they're terminated and they go away?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there is. We are starting a new project this year with the Department of Natural Resources looking at cover crop fields on Department of Natural Resources property. And in our research with cover crops, there's wide variation in farmers when they want to terminate. Some are very eager to get out there, and so they're terminating, end of March, while others are not so in such a big rush, and so they're not terminating until May. And it's a complex situation, right? So the longer it goes, the more it provides habitat for migratory birds. The flip side of that is if you go way into May, then birds start thinking, well, this habitat's going to be here, right? I should start breeding. And so you have birds start nesting out there. Well, next thing you know, people come through and spray it with the Roundup and start working the land to plant their crash crop, and then those nests get destroyed. And so we call that an ecological trap. And that it looks like a good place for a bird to spend its summer, raise its young, but it's not, obviously, because it's all gonna be destroyed for the cash crop. So there's probably a sweet spot in there where it's good for migratory birds, but we don't go long enough to start tricking birds into trying to breed and waste all their energy and resources into breeding at a site where they're not going to be able to reproduce.
A couple of final questions for you. Do cover crops attract a wider diversity of species?
Well, then traditional ag, yes, for sure. So in the research we did a couple years ago, several species of conservation concern that migrate through Illinois are there. A lot more meadowlarks, a lot more sparrows. I mean, to the average, we go out and work with producers, and the average producer doesn't really know the difference between some of these birds, but some are actually very interested and go out with us, and I think a lot of them are really, really struck by the fact that I can point to this bird and say, a month ago that bird was in South America, and it's stopping over in this field because you have this little bit of habitat on its way to breed in northern part of Alaska, and so there's a lot more diversity in these cover crop fields than I think people realize. And again, it's a good example, just a little bit of a different agricultural practice that has obviously benefits for on the agronomy side, can also benefit these birds. And we're not talking, diversity like you would see in some of the Shawnee National Forests or some really nice areas in Illinois, but you could see 20, 30 species out in those areas, and you compare that to like a corn or soybean field where you might see 4 or 5 species that time of year. So it definitely is a benefit.
Any advice for producers, landowners who are interested in increasing the bird activity on their properties and using cover crops, what the good things and maybe foibles might be?
Right. So we found that cereal rye, which happens to also be, in my understanding, it's the most popular cover crop and the cover crop that might provide the most benefit in terms of sequestering nitrogen, also is the best cover crop for wildlife. And so, I know there's like crimson clover and turnips and other types of cover crops, and we've worked in like I guess it's turnips and parsnips, but it didn't seem like the wildlife used that as much. They really like these cereal rye, and the earlier you get it planted, and the more growth you get in the fall, and there's kind of more structure there in the spring. We see them using that more, and so yeah. I mean, my advice is to there's lots of groups out there, NRCS, and private organizations that promote these cover crops, and getting cereal rye out there, could be a benefit to, in the nutrient perspective, but also it's going to benefit wildlife.
Mike Ward is an associate professor in the College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. He's been exploring the interaction of migratory birds and cover crops. Rick Kirchenfaught is a farmer from Gibson City and has some experience in this area. I asked him to tell us a little bit about his farm.
We have traditionally been the typical conservative tillage farmer with chisel plowing the corn stalks, cultivating in the spring, disking the bean stubble. And recently, I think we started with the cover crops approximately 7 years ago. And it started off with just experimenting with some cereal rye. We had a compacted farm that tried to loosen up the soil a little bit, so we spread the cereal rye with the potash on the corn stalks after harvest, and it did a really fine job at loosening the soil, but also helped control some of the water hemp and mare's tail that we had issues with on that particular farm, which kind of led us down the path of the no-till and cover crops and soil health, and it started opening up our eyes as to the benefits that each of these things brought. But it was quite a large learning curve, so we took it one step at a time. We had some success stories, and like anybody else, it didn't always work like it was supposed to, and there's sometimes it didn't go so well, but we learn from our mistakes and keep moving forward.
How is it that you decided that you would be interested in cover crops and bird habitat at the farm?
Well, the cover crops, we opened the door into the bird habitat. So as a result of the increased use of cover crops, came the insects. They were able to overwinter and survive with the more flowering plants, the diversity of plants that we had out there. We saw an increase of beetles, crickets, spiders, and it was out of concern of some of the pests that could possibly overwinter that took us, I guess, even further expansion of our types of cover crops that we use. So we wanted to uh, sort of do an integrated pest management program, increase the habitat of the beneficial insects in hopes to control any potential pests that may arise, such as slugs or armyworms. So we started using some native species, some grasses and forbs, and intend to graze them. They started off with just buffer strips, but once we realized that we had flowering plants and the increased variety of plants and a living root system in the ground year round, we saw huge increases in insect populations. And at the same time, we started noticing increase in bird populations.
How did the bird populations change?
Just the numbers and the diversity of the birds. I wasn't. I'm kind of behind the curve on the different types of birds and their habitats. So I reached out to Dr. Nick Sider and Brody Dunn, who helped me begin identifying some of the insects and birds that we had on the farm. And we see an upland sandpiper from time to time, or blue grosbeak, increased pheasant population, harrier hawks. So just a much larger diversity as well as increased numbers.
Has your management strategy changed over the years to impact the types of birds that come?
It has. And part of that has to do with planting some of the native grasses and flowers, and trying to keep some plants flowering and living roots year round. and leave that habitat so that the birds and insects can overwinter.
Finally, what advice might you have for farmers and landowners who are interested in increasing bird activity, species diversity within their farm and using cover crops?
It takes time. It will respond. It is possible to have the profitability and the changes, but it just takes time for the soil to heal itself. It takes time for the insects to rebound. It takes time for the birds to come. So it's baby steps, but as long as we keep moving forward, I think the rewards are well worth the effort. And it's not something you're going to see a quick response in 1 year, but it's over a period of several years of improved habitat overall will bring larger numbers.
That was Rick Kirchenfott. He's a farmer from the Gibson City, Illinois area, not very far actually from the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. You heard him mention entomologist Nick Sider and his grad student Brody Dunn as it related to identifying the changing species of insects and birds on some of his farms. I caught up with the grad student, Brody Dunn, and talked to him a little bit about the work he's been doing.
I'm a longtime resident of Central Illinois, former president of the Champaign County Audubon Society, a current graduate student in the Cider Lab here at the University of Illinois. Grew up in a small town close to here, and like you said, I've loved birds for a long time.
What's your master's research focus on?
I'm looking into the pest and beneficial arthropods in soybeans following the planting of cereal rye cover crops. But I'm also interested in my research into the effects of cover crops and on birds and the bird community.
What interested you in studying that relationship?
Birds are on a massive decline. They're really reducing in numbers. We have lots of scientists, lots of data and science to back that up, but really one of the more compelling things that I've sort of heard is all of these old timers that I bird with are constantly saying, the migratory season isn't what it used to be. Bird migration is not what it used to be. The trees used to just drip with warblers and with sparrows, and we just don't see that anymore. And that's really what got me interested.
How do things change when you look at bird populations in cover crops?
In cover crops, the difference between cover crops and no cover crops is pretty staggering whenever you're out there in the field. I can walk into, when I was doing my bird surveys, I could walk into a non-cover cropped field, just a bare field, and I would do my 5-minute survey, and I'd just be sitting there with my pen and my binoculars for the entire 5 minutes and write nothing down, right? And then I could drive a quarter mile down the road to the next field, and I would fill up the entire sheet in 5 minutes. I would barely be able to keep up with the number of birds that were out there.
How does it change over the seasons?
Right, so we have a huge flux of birds that come in the spring and the fall, and that coincides with the migratory season. And apart from that, we have seasonal birds that are with us in the summer and with us in the winter, and we would call those resident birds.
What impact does it have on insect populations in the cover crop itself and coincidentally in the cash crop after the fact?
The short answer is that we just don't know. Birds are out there, birds are eating insects, but figuring out exactly what insects the birds are eating is really pretty difficult. To do it accurately, you would have to use genetic testing, and to my knowledge, no one has done that yet. We do know that birds can reduce pest insect populations in other biomes, places like tropics where insects are like hyperabundant, but we're just not sure that's the case here.
Is there a downside to having birds create habitat in the cover crops?
The biggest downside to a bird making a home in a cover crop is likely always going to be for the bird. In the best of circumstances, they're going to get sprayed with herbicide, and in the worst of circumstances, which is, to be totally honest, the more likely of the two, it's going to get and its nest and its eggs might get destroyed by field equipment.
Can the birds prey upon pest insects that we traditionally may have controlled with an insecticide?
That's possible. There are, a ton of caterpillars out there, a ton of insects that are good eating for birds. And if left to their own devices, those insects would be eating our crops. But even with, really abundant birds, I'm not totally sure that they will be sufficient by themselves at controlling any major pest outbreak.
Brody Dunn is a crop sciences graduate student here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. He's been working with extension entomologist Nick Sider. You've been listening to episode 34 of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction podcast, Taking Flight with Cover Crops as Bird Habitat. The program was produced in conjunction with Illinois Extension Watershed Outreach Associates, Jennifer Jones and Rachel Curry. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.